السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. معكم فتح الرحمن إدريس، أستاذ مساعد بقسم التشريح. إن شاء الله هكون معكم في هذا السمستر بمحاضرات الجنرال هيستولوجي. وأول محاضرة اليوم هتكون عن الإبيثيليال تيشو. هنتناول إن شاء الله الإبيثيليال تيشو في كذا محاضرة. اليوم هو هيكون أول محاضرة لنا معنا. The objectives of this lecture is to identify the epithelial tissue and its functions, to know the characteristics of the epithelial cells, to identify the structure and functions of the basement membrane, to identify the structure and function of the intercellular adhesions and junctions found between the epithelial cells. The content of this lecture is body tissues, the epithelial tissue, functions of the epithelial tissue, characteristic features of the epithelial cells, the basement membrane, intercellular adhesions and junctions. The human body consists of 4 basic types of tissues. The epithelial tissue, it covers body surfaces, lines the body cavities, and forms glands. The connective tissue underlies or supports the other 3 basic tissues, both structurally and functionally. The muscular tissue is made up of contractile cells and is responsible for movement. Nerve tissue receives, transmits, and integrates information from outside and inside the body to control the activities of the body. These are the 4 basic types of body tissues: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, and nerve tissue. We will discuss each of these tissues separately in separate lectures. Today we'll talk briefly about epithelial tissue. The epithelial tissues are composed of closely aggregated polyhedral cells with a strong adhesion to one another, and they are attached to a thin layer of extracellular matrix. The epithelial cells أو epithelial tissues is مكونة من closely aggregated polyhedral cells with a strong adhesion to each other, and they are attached to thin layer of extracellular matrix. The functions of the epithelial tissue, the main functions is protection, and this done by covering the surfaces like the skin or lining the body cavities. And also the second function is absorption, like in the intestinal lumen. We have the function of absorption. The secretion, like the parenchymal cells of the glands. The other specific functions for the epithelial tissue, it can be some specific cells can be contractile cells like myoepithelial cells. We will talk about these types of cells later in the coming lectures, inshallah. Also, we have specialized sensory cells, and these specialized sensory cells are epithelial cells found in taste buds and in the olfactory epithelium, concerned with the smelling olfactory epithelium. The characteristic features of the epithelial cells consist of the following. The epithelial cells have variable shape and size. They vary. They can be columnar, cuboidal, or squamous. Columnar cells, tall columnar cells, cuboidal cells, and squamous cells. And the shape of the nucleus depends on the shape of the cells. We notice that the nuclei of the columnar cells are elliptic or oval. The nuclei of the cuboidal cells are spherical, and the nuclei of the squamous cells are more flattened. The epithelia do not normally contain blood vessels. They are avascular. Most epithelia, why? Most epithelia rest on connective tissue, and this connective tissue contains the microvasculature, bringing the nutrients and oxygen to both tissues. It brings this microvasculature found in the connective tissue. It brings the nutrients and oxygen for both, for the epithelia and connective tissue. The connective tissue that underlies the epithelia lining the organs of the digestive tract, respiratory, and urinary systems is called the lamina propria. The contact between the epithelium and connective tissue may be increased by irregularities at the interface in the form of small evaginations called papillae. And these papillae most frequently found in epithelia that exposed to friction, frequent friction, الاحتكاك الكثير in skin, الجلد, and tongue. بنلقى فيها papillae اللي هي at the junction between the epithelium and the connective tissue there is evaginations. These evaginations are called papillae. هتمر علينا قدام إن شاء الله لما نجي للسكين والtongue later on in this semester or in the next semester. The epithelial cells generally show polarity. The region of the cell contacting the connective tissue is called the basal pole. The opposite end, usually facing space or a lumen, is the apical pole. The regions that adjoin the neighboring cells are the lateral surfaces. The epithelial cells generally they show polarity. They have apical pole, basal pole, and lateral surfaces. At the interface of the epithelial cells and the underlying connective tissue lies the basement membrane. What is the basement membrane? The basement membrane, as we see, these cuboidal cells at the junction or the interface between the epithelial cells and the underlying connective tissue, will find this red line, fine line, red line. This is the basement membrane, and also here and here. In the right picture, the arrows indicate the basement membrane. You will see this histological section in the kidney. This is a glomerulus, and we notice that this dark red line surrounding is the basement membrane, and also here and here in this arrow also indicates basement membrane. The basement membrane with the transmission electron microscope TEM, the basement membrane can be divided or resolved into two structures. يعني بالإلكترون مايكروسكوب بيظهر لنا basement membrane as two structures. The basal lamina 20 to 100 nanometer thick, and this consisting of a network of fine fibrils. The reticular lamina is more diffuse and fibrous. The basal lamina is nearest to the basal part of the epithelium, the epithelial cells. The reticular lamina is close to the underlying connective tissue. As we see in this electron microscopic picture, TEM picture, this picture taken by transmission electron microscope to show the two parts of the basement membrane. This upper part, denoted by C, is the epithelial cell, and here is the basal domain, the basal part of the epithelial cell. At the basal part, we'll see this gray region, BL, is the basal lamina, and this region is the reticular lamina, RL. So this and this, they compose the basement membrane. ودي ما بتظهر لنا إلا بالإلكترون مايكروسكوب picture دي. In the light microscope, it appears as just one line, and it's called basement membrane. The electron microscope, it appears as two parts. The basal lamina, this is clear boundaries, and here we have more diffuse and fibrous reticular lamina. H stands for Hemidesmosomes, and we will talk about it later. C stands for the epithelial cell, and this is basal lamina, reticular lamina. The basal lamina is composed of the following transmembrane proteins: laminin, T4-collagen, and these two, laminin and T4-collagen, they are connected together via the adhesive glycoprotein intactin and nidogen, and the protoglycan called perlecan. These are the components of the basal lamina. Laminin, T4-collagen, connected together by intactin and nidogen, and protoglycan perlecan. The reticular lamina contains type 3 collagen. So we finished talking about the structure of the basement membrane. Now we move to the functions of the basement membrane. It provides the structural support and the polarity to the epithelial cells. It attaches the epithelia to the underlying connective tissue. The basement membrane proteins help filtering substances entering the epithelium from below and concentrate mitogenic growth factors. Also, the basement membrane proteins form a scaffold for epithelial repair and regeneration. The basal lamina components, which are laminin, T4-collagen, and intactin nidogen and perlecan, these basal lamina components help organize the proteins in the plasma membrane of the epithelial cells. The basement membrane proteins also mediate many cell-to-cell interactions, and they mark the routes for certain cell migrations along epithelia. Now we move to this to the third content of this lecture, the intercellular adhesions and junctions. The epithelial cells adhere strongly to neighboring cells and the basal laminae. The lateral surfaces of the epithelial cells exhibit several specialized intercellular junctions. These serve different functions. We'll talk about it. The first type of junctions is the tight junctions, zonule occludens. The adherent junctions, zonule adherens, desmosome, macula adherens, and the junction. In this graph, you will see, this is the apical part of the epithelium. You see microvilli, and this is a section through the epithelial cell. To note the tight junctions here between this cell and this cell, there is tight junctions, and also there is adherence junction or zonule adherence. This desmosomes and gap junction. The basal domain of the epithelial cell attaches to the subjacent basal lamina by hemidesmosomes. The hemidesmosomes, they are found to bind the basal domain of the epithelial cell with the basal lamina. We'll talk about the first type of junctions, is the tight junction or zonular occludens. It forms a seal between the adjacent cells. Seal بمعنى لحام. They are occluding, tight. It forms a band completely encircling each cell. يعني here it encircles the cell completely. It is formed by interactions. The tight junction is formed by interactions between the transmembrane proteins, claudin, occludin, and ZO proteins of each cell. These transmembrane proteins interact together to form the zonular occludens. This is the previous image as we shown. This is tight junctions, and they form complete seal and encircle the cell. These are the tight junctions. On the right side, you will see magnification to see the structure of the tight junction. This is the occludin protein and the claudin protein and the ZO proteins on the cytoplasmic site. This is the cytoplasm of one cell, epithelial cell, and this cytoplasm of the other adjacent cell. You will see the ZO proteins. Okay, the ZO proteins, they connect finally with actin filaments. So the structure of the tight junction is composed of occludin, claudin, ZO proteins, and the ZO proteins on the cytoplasmic site. They bind the actin filaments. This is the actin. The major function of tight junction is it seals the adjacent cells to one another, controlling the passage of molecules between them, and it separates the apical and basolateral membrane domains. The second type is adherent junction or zonular adherence. It also encircles the epithelial cell, usually immediately below the zonular occludens. It is an anchoring junction. Cell adhesion here is mediated by cadherins, type of transmembrane proteins, that transmembrane glycoproteins that interact in the presence of calcium, these cadherins. Cadherins bind catenin on the cytoplasmic side. They bind catenin that is linked via actin binding proteins to actin filaments. As we see from the apical part, more close to the apical part is the tight junctions, below it is the adherent junctions or zonular adherence. And they are formed by cadherin, E-cadherin. As we see here, the membranes of adjacent cells. This is the cytoplasmic site, and this is the intercellular region. And we see this is the adherent junction composed of E-cadherin protein bound by calcium, and on the cytoplasmic site we have catenin and vinculin. The catenin then binds to the actin filament. Okay, the catenin on the cytoplasmic site bind via this actin binding proteins vinculin to the actin filaments. The major function, it provides the linking the points linking the cytoskeleton of adjacent cells, these adherent junctions. They provide link of cytoskeleton of epithelial cell and its adjacent cell, and it strengthens and it stabilizes the nearby tight junctions. The third type is desmosome or macular adherence. It's an anchoring junction also. The desmosomes are disc-shaped structures at the surface of one cell that are matched with identical structures at an adjacent cell surface. Desmosomes contain the following proteins: cadherins, two types, desmoglein and desmocholine, two proteins. They belongs to the family of cadherins, and it contains also anchoring proteins, placoglobin and desmoplakin. These are found on the cytoplasmic site. They are connected to the cadherins, and on the cytoplasmic side they bind the intermediate filaments. As we see again, the desmosome, these are desmosomes or called macule adherents. It is like spots, okay, spots of junctions. These spots on the right side, as we see, you see these membranes of the adjacent cells. This is the cytoplasmic site of this cell, and this cytoplasmic site of the other cell. We'll find that the transmembrane proteins are desmocholine and desmoglein. On the cytoplasmic side, they attach to this intracellular attachment plaque, which is composed of the previous proteins we talked about, the placoglobin and desmoplakin. Placoglobin and desmoplakin, they connect or bind to the intermediate filaments. As we see in the left side, they bind to the intermediate filaments, and all these desmosomes are connected to each other. So they link the cytoskeleton of the cells and strengthen the epithelium. The desmosomes, it provides point of strong intermediate filament coupling between adjacent cells, strengthening the epithelial tissue. The gap junctions, the fourth type, they mediate communication rather than adhesion or occlusion between cells. They are called communicating junctions. The gap junction is composed of proteins called connexins. The connexins form hexameric complexes called connexons. يبقى الواحد اسمه كونكسين، لما يبقوا مع بعض hexameric complex 6 يعملوا connexon, and each connexon has a central hydrophilic pore about 1.5 nanometer in diameter. As we see, also the gap junctions, they form spots, they found as spots. And on the right side, we'll see this section, in this graph, we have membranes of adjacent cells in this diagram, sorry. The membranes of the adjacent cells, they are connected via the gap junctions, which are communicating junctions. They are formed of what? Of connexins, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Each one is called connexin. Together they form a complex called connexon. And in the middle of this connexon we have this pore, فتحة. الفتحة دي communicating between the two cells. Its here is open, here is closed. The major function of the gap junction, it allows direct transfer of small molecules and ions from one cell to another. يعني هي communicating. تسمح لمرور the small molecules and the ions from one cell to another. أي molecule less than 1.5 nanometer in diameter، لأنه the pore diameter بتاعه 1.5 nanometer. All the molecules and ions should be less than this to transfer from one cell to another. Also, the gap junctions is very important because it connects. It's a method of communication between the cells so that they can function as synchronously as one unit. Example, in the heart, these gap junctions are found in the heart so that the cardiac muscles, they contract synchronously as a one unit because of the presence of these gap junctions. The hemidesmosomes, they bind the epithelial cells. This is found at the basal part. They bind the epithelial cells, basal domain of the epithelial cells, to the underlying basal lamina. They are not found in the lateral surface. They are found in the basal surface. And they resemble a half desmosome ultrastructurally. يعني هي أصغر حجما من الديسموسوم hemidesmosomes. They are half desmosome. They contain abundant integrins. يعني the transmembrane proteins of the hemidesmosomes, they are integrins rather than cadherins. The integrin proteins bind the extracellular macromolecules laminin and collagen type 4. وزي ما مذكرين إنه اللامينين and collagen type 4 they are components of the basal lamina. So the integrin proteins found in the desmosome, they bind to the laminin and collagen type 4 found in the basal lamina. The major function of the hemidesmosome is anchoring the cytoskeleton of the epithelial cell to the underlying basal lamina. So we reached the end of this lecture. Let's summarize together what we have learned in this lecture. That first thing, that the epithelial tissue is composed of aggregated polyhedral cells. The main functions of epithelium are protection, absorption, and secretion. The epithelium is avascular. The epithelial cells have a variability in shape and size, and they show polarity. The basement membrane is composed of basal and reticular laminae. The intercellular adhesions and junctions include tight junction, adherent junction, desmosome, and gap junction. Hemidesmosomes bind the basal surface of the epithelial cells to the basal lamina. So this lecture for today has ended. See you.